Welcome to Vegas Hockey Hub here in the sports entertainment capital of the world, Las Vegas, Nevada, on PRConnectionsRadio.com, the voice of new media. I'm your host, Ian Rakelli. And this is going to be a part 4 of a series we have been doing here on Vegas Hockey Hub. Episode 1, as we look back at the 2017 NHL expansion draft, and we examine 5 years later what happened to those picks in the Vegas Golden Knights in 2017. Episode 2 was talking about the 2019 NHL offseason and how, looking back on it, it was the most impactful offseason in Vegas Golden Knights history. And part 3 was looking back at the 2017 NHL draft and how it affected the Vegas Golden Knights 5 years later. Well, this part 4 is we're going to be looking back at the best trade in Vegas Golden Knights history. We're going to be examining and analyzing how the Vegas Golden Knights pulled off the best trade in their franchise so far, and how calling up a team out in DC and trading for a player that was scouted and drafted and recruited by the current president of hockey operations with the Vegas Golden Knights, how sending him from Washington to Vegas made the biggest difference to this guy's career. How acquiring one guy has made Vegas a stronger team, has made Vegas a better team overall. So, the part 4 of the looking back here on Vegas Hockey Hub, looking back at the best trade in Vegas Golden Knights history, and the player that we're talking about today, the player that we are going to be discussing on tonight's show, is Chandler Stephenson, who is the alternate captain of the Vegas Golden Knights. Chandler Stephenson has become a good member of Vegas. He has become a guy that you can rely on and that you can count on in Vegas on that top 6. But in order for us to really discuss Chandler Stephenson, before we really break down how he has affected Vegas and how he really made an impact here in Vegas, we got to go back to the beginning. We have to go back to where it all started to give you some context. So, Chandler Stephenson, who is from Saskatchewan, Canada, he made his start with the Regina Pats, the Regina Patriots of the WHL. And his stats from his 4 years playing in Regina, not only did he put up some stellar numbers in his career, but when it came to Chandler Stephenson, he was a guy that put up some numbers. I mean, he had 22 goals in 2011, 2012, had 89 points in his final season of the WHL, 2013, 2014. This is a guy who also had a plus 27 in that season where he had 89 points. And he was also very physical as well. He actually accumulated over 100 penalty minutes in his 4 years in Regina. So he plays 4 years in the WHL. He appears in the World Hockey Championships for the under-17 team for Canada. So he has done a good amount of stuff in his career up to that point. And him having that performance in the WHL, the Western Hockey League, it actually led to Chandler Stephenson being drafted in the 3rd round of the 2012 NHL draft by Washington. Now, a key note that you have to think about, and something that I really didn't appreciate until doing the research for this, is that George McPhee, who is the current president of hockey operations for the Vegas Golden Knights, he was the general manager of the Washington Capitals at the time Chandler Stephenson was drafted. When Chandler Stephenson was drafted by Washington, George McPhee was the guy in charge during that span. And sure enough, he is the current president of hockey operations for the Vegas Golden Knights. That is a part that I really want to focus on because George McPhee is a vital part of why Chandler Stephenson is now a Vegas Golden Knight. It's very vital to point out that Chandler Stephenson having that connection will factor in later on when I get into him coming from Washington and going to Vegas. Now, that round he gets selected in, where he is selected 77th overall, is actually interesting because of the talent that got drafted in the same round as him. Not only did Giannis Korpisalo get drafted in the same round by Columbus, you also had goaltender Chris Drager be selected one pick ahead of Chandler Stephenson. Now, Chris Drager, he was with Ottawa. He went over to Florida. Now he is with the Seattle Kraken. The next pick after Chandler Stephenson ended up being defenseman Shane Gostisbehere, Ghost, as they put him in Philadelphia. And not only did he have a good career in Philadelphia, but he also is now playing for Arizona and is one of the marquee attractions this NHL trade deadline. You also had Oscar Sundqvist, who is now playing in Florida. You had Matt Murray, who is a two-time Stanley Cup championship goaltender, was selected a few picks after Chandler Stephenson. And the Anaheim Ducks selected Freddie Anderson a couple of picks later. So that round in 2012 actually had a lot of good talent around it. It's actually quite surprising how in the third round of the 2012 NHL draft, Chandler Stephenson was one of the handful of guys who turned out to be very productive in the NHL coming from that 2012 NHL draft. So he gets drafted by Washington. So he eventually has to go to the minors. He eventually plays in the American Hockey League, the AAA of hockey. And he only plays a few games his first few seasons in the AHL. He does not really establish himself until about 2014, 2015. He has 7 goals, 14 points in 54 games for Hershey. And then 2015, 2016, he plays less games with them because of his split with the Washington Capitals, which we'll talk about later in the show. But he has 7 goals, 28 points in only 46 games. So he is improving as a professional hockey player year by year. The next season, 2016-2017, he plays a full 72 games, has 10 goals, 38 points, and 42 penalty minutes. People forget that Chandler Stephenson, he can drop the gloves and he can be physical if he has to. So every single year he was in the AHL, he progresses, he scores more points, his plus minus keeps going up, and Chandler Stephenson is providing value to Washington, regardless if it's in the AHL or eventually when he gets to the NHL. You could see that Chandler Stephenson had talent, that he could score goals during that time span. And after playing only 6 games in the AHL to begin the 2017-2018 season, he eventually joins the Washington Capitals. He eventually joins Washington and becomes a full-time member of the Washington Capitals. And his statistics from that 2015-2017 season, he really didn't score that many points. But it is from 2017-2018, 2018-2019, and 2019-2020 where Chandler Stephenson really became a solid member of the Washington Capitals organization. He had a trio of seasons where Chandler Stephenson was on the bottom 6, spending valuable minutes in Washington, and he was actually providing a good amount of talent out there in Washington for that time being. So Chandler Stephenson, in those years that he is playing for Washington, that 2017-2018 season is actually very vital when it comes to Chandler Stephenson. Not only did he have 18 points in 67 games, which actually was the best season he had in Washington in his career, but more importantly, in 2017-2018, he plays in the Stanley Cup playoffs. He has 7 points in 24 games, and the Washington Capitals, after having him for a few seasons, you see that right there. Chandler Stephenson on the bottom six in Las Vegas at the T-Mobile Arena. He hoists the Stanley Cup. He is part of that 2018 Stanley Cup championship roster, and Chandler Stephenson was a vital part of that bottom six. He played a handful of minutes out there in Washington during that time. So Chandler Stephenson hoisting that Stanley Cup, spending time in Washington. The next season, he only has, like I said, 5 goals, 11 points in 64 games. But it's where the 2019-2020 season, where he becomes a vital part of what's about to happen next. In December 2nd of 2019, Chandler Stephenson goes from wearing that Washington Capitals uniform to becoming a Vegas Golden Knight. Now, the one vital part of this deal was that it happened in December of 2019. This did not happen at the traditional trade deadline in 2020. This did not happen when most trades take effect, which is normally in February or March of the trade deadline season. I also want to keep in mind that if it would have happened during a traditional trade deadline, it wouldn't have happened because of what happened in 2020. The COVID situation is what ended up halting the NHL and actually prematurely caused things to happen. So in an alternate universe somewhere, the Vegas Golden Knights don't acquire Chandler Stephenson. He stays with the Washington Capitals because of COVID, and he eventually joins some other team. But thankfully, he ends up getting traded to Vegas on December 2nd, 2019 for a 4th-round pick. Now, for anyone who's a Vegas Golden Knights fan or anyone who's a hockey fan who wants to know what he got traded for, who was the player he ended up being traded for, well, that one is actually very simple. So in the 2021 draft, that draft pick that was sent for Chandler Stephenson wasn't even used by Washington. What ended up happening is that a few months later, after being acquired in that situation, the Washington Capitals then trade it to the Philadelphia Flyers, and the Philadelphia Flyers end up selecting defenseman Ty Merchant. So you have that situation where the Philadelphia Flyers actually ended up getting the pick almost a few months later in this deal. So Washington didn't benefit from it. Philadelphia got the prospect. We'll see if they eventually develop. But Vegas ended up getting the best part of the deal because Chandler Stephenson has been a vital part and has really become a monster for the Vegas Golden Knights. Chandler Stephenson's stats in Vegas, his first season in the Vegas Golden Knights system, he was really finding his stride on the bottom six. He was a guy that Vegas was really relying on to be a vital part of that team. In 41 games in that first season, 22 points, 8 of them were goals. But here's one part that I couldn't put on here due to restraints. He had a plus 19 with the Vegas Golden Knights. And if you want to include his plus 5 he had in Washington in the first 24 games of the season, that means that Chandler Stephenson had a plus 24 in the 2019-2020 season. He also got to the playoffs that year, played 20 games for Vegas, had a trio of goals, 5 points, and a plus 2 for Vegas. As a matter of fact, the photo you have right there is actually from the 2020 bubble that the Vegas Golden Knights were a part of. When they were down there in Vancouver and down there in Edmonton, Chandler Stephenson playing those 20 games in Vegas during the playoff run, him actually putting 5 points up was vital for the bottom six. And I will actually point out that his performance in 2019-2020 is what helped him become a middle six forward for the Vegas Golden Knights. That's why that next season, he only missed 5 games during the COVID-restricted 56-game 2020-2021 season. And he had 14 goals, 35 points, and once again, a plus 22 for the Vegas Golden Knights, who went on to have the number 2 seed in the Western Conference that season. This was a team that ended up having an equal record with the President's Trophy winner, Colorado Avalanche, during that season. And in 16 playoff games in that 2021 Stanley Cup playoffs, he had 6 points and a +8 during that 16 games that they played. So Chandler Stephenson ended up becoming a good member of Vegas, not just from a statistic standpoint, but Chandler Stephenson went from being on the bottom 6, was given up for a low round draft pick, was traded to Vegas, became a vital part of the bottom 6, earned his way into being in the middle 6, and then finally got his promotion to the top 6. In the 2021-2022 season, injuries riddled the Vegas Golden Knights. Injuries ended up costing Vegas a lot of their talent on the top 6. So Chandler Stephenson went from being on the 3rd line pretty much the first 2 seasons in Vegas to not just playing on the 2nd line. Chandler Stephenson was playing first line minutes at some point in the 2021-2022 season. This was a guy in Chandler Stephenson who was playing alongside Mark Stone. He was playing alongside Jonathan Marchessault, playing alongside Riley Smith and William Karlsson, Alex Tuch when he was still in Vegas, Jack Eichel when he eventually got to Vegas. Chandler Stephenson was rotating between the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd line during those 79 games he played for Vegas. And those 79 games means he only missed a trio because of injury. Chandler Stephenson was a reliable, consistent forward for the Vegas Golden Knights because he rarely missed games. He was in the lineup day in and day out for the Vegas Golden Knights. And him being on the top 6 rewarded Chandler Stephenson. He had 21 goals, 64 points during that time period. He also had a +5 as well. Chandler Stephenson also was able to show not just the fans, not just management, but showed everyone in the hockey world who he was. You would see him play with Mark Stone, the way he'd be passing the puck around. Chandler Stephenson, his calm nature, the way he collected himself on the ice. He was a long-established veteran by this point. Chandler Stephenson, by the time he's a top 6 forward for Vegas, he is no longer the young, up-and-coming guy for the Hershey Bears in Washington. No, he is now a guy who has been 8 years in to the NHL, and Chandler Stephenson now has become a good member of the Vegas Golden Knights. Chandler Stephenson has become a reliable asset for Vegas. So Chandler Stephenson, really for people who are watching the Vegas Golden Knights, the reason why he is the best trade in Vegas Golden Knights history, the reason why Chandler Stephenson was the best trade that they have done was because that George McPhee went back to someone he drafted. George McPhee called up his former team, the Washington Capitals, and acquired a player that he scouted, recruited, drafted. He was a guy that was developed in George McPhee's system. George McPhee would have known firsthand what Chandler Stephenson was all about. And that's why in 2019, when he got traded to the Vegas Golden Knights, it mattered. Because George McPhee took a flyer on a guy he once drafted, traded a mid-round pick to Washington to acquire him, and his stats with Vegas have backed up why he was selected and traded for during the George McPhee era. Because George McPhee trusted and believed that Chandler Stephenson could become a good player for Vegas. And all you have to do is just look at his points in Vegas compared to his points in Washington, and you could see that he has overcome and really has overexcelled from what he was supposed to do out there. when he was under the old Washington Capitals organization, when they swapped out general managers, when George McPhee was no longer the top guy, he did not have the same oomph that he did in Vegas. This was a Washington Capitals team. He only had 14 goals in his entire 5 seasons in Washington. Chandler Stephenson, keep in mind, he has had 47 goals with the Vegas Golden Knights. I mean, that is incredible in itself that he has had 47 goals in Vegas, but only had 14 goals with his time in the Washington Capitals. Chandler Stephenson had a career resurgence and a career renaissance being in Vegas, all because one guy believed he could do it, and he believed that he could bring him in and be part of the Vegas Golden Knights. And lastly, I want to talk about this for a minute. There is a certain person that I know. I'm not going to say names. There's a certain someone who I know who loves to talk about misfits. Talks about the ideology and the belief that Vegas is a group of misfits. Well, I've made that argument to that someone. Chandler Stephenson and a bunch of players who have been brought in by Vegas after year one believe in the idea of misfits. A guy like Chandler Stephenson would 1,000% be a misfit if you're basing it off the ideology. The ideology after year one was the misfits were a bunch of players who were abandoned, right? They were players who were tossed aside. They were given up by their team. They were pretty much second chances in Vegas. That was what the idea was. If you go based off of that logic, if you're a Vegas Golden Knights fan who believes in the misfits, you've got your misfit right here. Chandler Stephenson was tossed aside in Washington. He was a bottom 6 guy at best, and he was on the 4th line in Washington, on the top line in Hershey. He was playing in the AHL for 5 seasons before really getting a shot with the Washington Capitals. So Chandler Stephenson is 1,000% that philosophy and that ideology that Vegas Golden Knights fans want to talk about. He is a misfit if you believe that the misfits were a bunch of players who were abandoned and tossed aside. Because Chandler Stephenson was abandoned and tossed aside before George McPhee came along and brought him back to him and then became a top 6 forward that you have today. So, as we got a few minutes left here on Vegas Hockey Hub, I'm your host, Ian Rakelli. The reason why I say he's the best trade in Vegas Golden Knights history was not just because they had to trade a mid-round pick for him. It's not just because of him scoring 10 points in his first 12 games for Vegas. Chandler Stephenson also has become a good player that should be part of Vegas long term. This is Chandler Stephenson, who signed a 4-year deal worth $11 million with Vegas back in 2020. This is a guy in Chandler Stephenson who has a current base salary of $3.1 million and will be a free agent at the end of 2024. And make no mistake about it, Chandler Stephenson will get a nice payday in the NHL. Chandler Stephenson, being a top 6 forward, he will make $4 to $5 million in the NHL when that contract comes up. Chandler Stephenson has earned a $4 million, $5 million contract with the Vegas Golden Knights. Now, if Vegas wants to re-sign him to that deal, I am all for it. If Vegas believes that Chandler Stephenson at his age, at 28 years old, if Chandler Stephenson is the guy they believe can be that player, someone who's had over 165 points in his career in the NHL, a guy who has played around 400 games of professional hockey. If Vegas is confident he can continue to be a bottom 6 forward or a top 6 forward, Chandler Stephenson is going to get paid by Vegas. And it would actually be a smart investment on Vegas's behalf, bringing back Chandler Stephenson because of the value he has brought the organization. His good defensive awareness and the way that he passes around the puck. Chandler Stephenson's hockey IQ is actually pretty good as well. The way he presents himself on the ice, the way he is calm and cool under pressure. Chandler Stephenson is also someone who can rough people up if need be. Chandler Stephenson is a player who can cause fights. He is a guy who can be rough and really toss his weight around if need be. So Chandler Stephenson has been a good player for Vegas. He has been a great addition to the Vegas Golden Knights. And on this show, your host, Ian Rickelli, I have made an argument to you that looking back at the best trade in Vegas Golden Knights history, it has to be Mr. Chandler Stephenson himself because of what they acquired in Chandler Stephenson versus what they gave up in the deal, which was essentially nothing because that pick they gave up to Washington was flipped to Philadelphia. So Washington didn't even get much in return for Chandler Stephenson. Now, with us having about 4 minutes left here on Vegas Hockey Hub, I want to quickly talk about PR Connections Radio. Now, PR Connections Radio, the voice of new media, I want to give a shout out to all of the shows that are on here. I want to talk about We Got the Power with Brian Gardner. You know, if you're somebody who's on the political side, someone who wants to listen to political talk, go watch Brian Gardner. If you want to watch someone do amazing interviews, go watch Cozy Stone. She brings on interviews. She brings on guests who are very knowledgeable about what they do. You also have Voices of Humanity. Sandra, I do want to give a lot of credit to her. What she has done over the last few months is incredible. I also want to talk about real quick one show on PR Connections Radio. You have the Professionals podcast. You have the Cause Chamber. You have the Love of Business, which just is building up right now. So PR Connections Radio is doing a lot right now. I want to give a shout out to Guy Dawson, by the way, because if it wasn't for Guy Dawson, the founder of PR Connections Radio, none of these shows would be on your airways right now. So want to give a shout out to him, Cozy Stone, Brian Gardner, Sandra, all the people who are part of PR Connections Radio. They do fantastic work. Go check all their content out as well. And to give you a little bit of a preview or a snippet of what we're going to be talking about next episode here on Vegas Hockey Hub, the Henderson Silver Knights out at the Dollar Loan Center, they have been having a rough start to 2022-2023 AHL season. And on Vegas Hockey Hub, we are going to be doing a report on the Henderson Silver Knights. We'll look over their last 10 games and discuss what has happened with Henderson. We're going to go over some key players with the Henderson Silver Knights and what they have done statistically and what they've done on the ice that you actually can't pick up statistically. Because the thing about hockey, there is a lot of stuff that happens on the ice that you cannot pick up using analytics. There are some stuff that use the eye test that you have to just watch and you have to know what you're looking for. So when it comes to Henderson, that's going to be a fantastic show to watch. I am definitely looking forward to talking about the Henderson Silver Knights here on Vegas Hockey Hub. And more importantly, I want to say to everyone who's watching around the world, continue watching hockey. Go support your junior hockey leagues. Doesn't matter if it's the USHL, WHL, OHL. It doesn't matter if it's the KMJHL. Regardless of where you are at, go support junior hockey. Go support your local college hockey team. Whatever you can do, go watch their games. Go shout them out on social media. Talk to the coaches, talk to the players. It is definitely encouraged to support junior hockey. I highly recommend it. Now, until next time, this is Vegas Hockey Hub. I'm your host, Ian Rickelli. Continue watching hockey and go Knights, go!